So, welcome to our YouTube Live on sociology and science communication. We're excited to chat with you for the next 30 to 45 minutes about sociology, science communication, and why sociology should inform science and science communication, or SciComm. I'm Shiva Ozma, a scientist turned science communicator, and I'm joined by Kelly Tabbitt, a sociology PhD student who will soon be on the faculty at Oberlin College. We're two of the faces behind Fancy Comma, a science communications company dedicated to educating scientists about the best practices in communication. We explain science to the world, not just to the general public, but also lawmakers, executives, and other important stakeholders. We also mentor and train science students in communication and talk a lot about the culture of science and ways that science is shaped by the people that perform it. If you're new here, hit the bell to subscribe to our channel and get notified each time we post a new video. Let's get started. Welcome, Kelly. Excited to chat with you today.
I'm excited to be here.
It's going to be a great discussion because last time we had a discussion, it did not get recorded.
But it was a great discussion.
It was great. It was incredible discussion. So we hope to recreate that discussion for now that we have our audio working. So, Kelly, you currently are a PhD student in sociology, which is a social science, that includes things like, I guess, psychology, sociology.
So social psychology, things like social psychology, demography is often a lot related with it.
So tell us about your role in the social sciences.
So my role is, threefold. So kind of student, researcher, instructor. As a researcher, my research areas focus on, I focus on settler colonialism, I focus on law and carceral studies, racialized inequality, and kind of more sort of centered within my research is looking at Native sovereignty, specifically in how it's constructed in U.S. Indian law. So I have my bachelor's and master's in sociology from UW, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I will have my PhD from OU this summer, which is super exciting. And that's as a student. And then as an instructor, while I was a PhD student, I've taught Introduction to Sociology and courses related to the criminal justice system and sociology of deviance and criminology. And then I'll kind of carry that over when I go to Oberlin. I'll be teaching critical criminology and carceral studies and then racialized inequality.
That's a lot of stuff, and it's all really interesting and super relevant to our current world. Because here in Oklahoma, we have several people that I think Richard Glossip is one of the most recent people. He's a man on death row here in Oklahoma. And we just got a new attorney general, Gentner Drummond, and he's thinking of completely reversing Richard Glossip's sentence, which is really interesting because for our last attorney general, we had Julius Jones was a guy on death row, and he was not ultimately executed, but the governor talked to, I guess, Kim Kardashian, other high-profile people were talking about that because we're one of those places where we use the death penalty, and we also have a lot of people in jails. And we also have like a really bad situation in our jails where people actually take their lives there. I think I was just watching the news right before we were like last weekend, and there was like probably like upwards of 10 people, like 17 people have committed suicide in the Oklahoma County jail this year. So it makes you wonder what's really happening in the state of, and that's not unique to Oklahoma. It's pretty much common. Like when you go to jail, you're not planning to have like a good experience there. So really important because that's going to, being a person that is incarcerated, you have no rights. Basically, they get taken away from you. You're unable to vote. You don't have, it's hard for you to get a job. So, and I think if we thought about the people that our encounters with the law and our interactions with it, when we think about the what's been happening with law enforcement and the way people see that, the sociology of incarceration becomes really important. So next question, what drew you to sociology and the social sciences generally?
So I think, sort of there's sort of four key aspects that I think, aren't unique to sociology per se, but feel really integral to sociology. And that I think sociology has the potential to do really well. So the first is interdisciplinarity. Interdisciplinariness, I think, partly because I'm just the type of person who just can't make up my mind as far as, when I was an undergrad, what field I wanted to go into. There are just so many different ways to look at questions and answer them. I think, sociology is really well positioned to listen to other fields and to inform other fields, other social science fields, but also other fields outside of the social sciences. So I think that's one of the main aspects that I appreciate about sociology. Another major thing that I appreciate about the social sciences, effectively anything that's studying human behavior, is the sort of pragmatic power that it can have. So you're studying, human behaviors, human events, issues and experiences that humans face. And I think that positions the science, because it is so deeply human, to really be to take the work that we do and what we learn and make it something that organizations and governments and individuals can actually put into real world practice in a sort of day-to-day way. I'd say the third thing that I really appreciate about sociology is the focus on reflexivity. Again, this is not unique to sociology. I think the idea of reflexivity actually originally comes from anthropology and was carried over to sociology. But this idea of like recognizing your own what's called positionality, but essentially recognizing sort of your own placement in society that can be based upon race, gender, class, et cetera. It can be based upon your occupation, your education, where you live, but just recognizing that all of those identities put you in sort of relations to other groups and to society in general, and just sort of realizing how that shapes your perception, how that shapes the interactions that you have, who you interact with, etc. And then I'd say the last thing that I really appreciate about social science, and sort of what makes me feel like I can do something that reflects the type of person that I am, is just, I say room for agency. So the fact that I think it was best put by W.E.B. Du Bois. He used to say that, or he said, and this is paraphrasing, but essentially that sociology is the study of the workings of free will within the structures of social boundaries, of like societal boundaries. So essentially that individuals recognizing that there are these boundaries that everybody has on what they can do and what they can see and et cetera, and that, but also recognizing that each individual has an amount of agency, which creates this sort of complexity to studying human behavior.
Yeah, I think when you think of society, Western culture is very individualized. We don't think of society that much. I was trying to think for example, one of the points I wanted to talk about today was we don't think about trauma, because we don't think about collective, this society at large. We think about ourselves and freedom of ourselves, and we have a different worldview than many other cultures. Granted, that's not to say that Eastern culture is necessarily good at handling like trauma. For example, when I was a researcher at Georgetown studying PTSD and trauma, there's a lot of sort of grin and bear it type culture in Asian culture. And that's pretty hard, because they don't even really recognize PTSD. I mean, they have PTSD, but their view of trauma is more like a grin and bear it type of thing. So it's interesting, the cultural, if we were better able to study sociology and science and apply it, we might learn that there's cultural and social differences in the way PTSD is diagnosed and the way, for example, we treat and diagnose depression. And
the radiating impacts throughout an individual's life, but even like intergenerationally, community level.
Next question, what is social psychom and how does this connect to your interest in social science?
So it applies the principles of psychom to things like political science, anthropology, psychology, sociology, obviously. Essentially what that means is psychom is the practice of making research methods, findings, etc., of a field, sociology, for example, um, relevant, interesting, and approachable, and applicable to broad audiences. So I'm thinking here specifically focusing on non-academic audiences. What I refer to as social psychom, a lot of people I think would probably call that public sociology, and they might have the equivalent like public psychology, etc. But yeah, essentially it's that same idea. It's about focusing or directing your research findings and teaching to the audiences, to audiences outside of the academic world. So outside, beyond students and professors, etc. So I think, one of the major ways that I think this connects to sort of my research focus area, but sociological and human social sciences in general. And there's many ways that it can connect, but I think one of the most obvious ways is thinking about, so in Indigenous sociology, which is sociology by and studying Indigenous people's experiences, there's a phrase, "nothing about us without us," which I think is shared by other fields, especially ones that focus on, or other topics that focus on marginalized communities. So ideally what that means is that you should not be writing research about, for example, I'm not Native. I'm a non-Native person. So I ideally really should not be writing about Indigenous experiences or Native experiences without at least consulting with people in those communities. Ideally, the research should be sort of co-authored and co-directed, if not even maybe led by those communities that are implicated in the research. But essentially, with what public sociology or social psychom, what these all kind of do, or the importance of these in bringing this research to the broad communities, is it opens up space for every member of that community, to be a part of that dialogue, to be able to understand the research that's going on and to have a voice, potentially to say like, hey, that's actually not what's happening. You're misreading that. Or, what about this aspect that you didn't, talk about? So basically creating a space and a voice for people outside of academics to influence and be informed of research.
And that's really important, not just for social sciences research, but for science research. Clinical trials are heavily white and male, and until recently, they didn't have diversity, because making clinical trials more diverse actually slows down your research. So it's important. That kind of stuff matters a lot, because if you only test your science, your medical product in one group of people, but then you give it to everyone, you're missing a huge part of society. And I guess that's where the sociology part comes in.
Excuse me.
So that's all really interesting, Kelly. Can you say a bit, after you take your water break, about any research you've done or are doing?
My master's thesis was looking at U.S. Supreme Court decisions since the 1800s, and essentially looking at the opinions, how justices interpreted the limitations and meaning of Native sovereignty, and how that has changed or stayed the same across time.
You studied Supreme Court cases with Native Americans. There's been a lot of them. There was McGirt, which had to do with prosecuting criminal people that have performed crimes in Oklahoma, and where their Native ancestry was.
So basically criminal jurisdiction in Oklahoma.
That's the more academic, normal way to say it. And that was a huge thing in Oklahoma, because our governor, though he's actually a member of the Cherokee Nation, he actually opposes McGirt, and it's one of the cornerstones of his administration has been to just fight McGirt at all odds. Really interesting. That's one. There was another one as well. There's a lot of Supreme Court cases that
there have been a lot over time too. I mean, the Cherokee removal was the result ultimately, of many factors, but the Supreme Court decision. Supreme Court decisions. So they're since the mid 1800s, and really a lot of the ways that in this country the U.S. Supreme Court understands the meaning of sovereignty is basically just a carryover from, laws or interpretations, precedents set in the 1800s. But my current doctoral research is focused on what I call, and many people call, racially disproportionate incarceration, otherwise referred to as over-incarceration. White incarcerated people certainly still make up, might make up close to 40 or 50%, but white people as a population make up between, 60 and 70% of the US. Black, Latino, and Native populations are overrepresented.
It gives you a lot to think about, because when you think about law, criminal, police reform, and then obviously a lot of people that are pulled over or that have encounters with the law end up going to jail. I saw this one video. It was like a white woman. She was literally like, she got a ticket. She was like, "Oh, I don't want this ticket. Can you turn it into a warning?" And the guy was like, "No, you're going to jail with me." And so I was like, wow, that's definitely an escalation that you don't want to happen. Have you done any research on, besides racism, like have they identified factors that cause this disproportionate incarceration level?
Yeah, it's really difficult to call these sorts of outcomes really kind of racist in and of themselves, because you think laws are just laws. They're on the books. They're not written as targeting any particular community. But, among other factors, we have to remember that there is a great deal of discretion left up to police officers, left up to judges and attorneys, probation officers, intake people, etc., that leaves a lot of room. So that's one way that plays out, even though laws in and of themselves at this point are not written explicitly racially.
Legally, our laws apply to everyone, but in practice, it doesn't always happen like that. Having a good lawyer, costs money.
Being able to afford bail, being able to afford getting sent to a rehab center rather than going to jail,
That makes a huge
like
difference, because as I was researching for this, people that have trauma, they're more likely to have substance abuse problems to cope, and many substances are illegal, so they get into criminal behavior, or they become addicted to something, and they do criminal activity to get drugs.
It's kind of easy to look at these inequalities in justice system contact, in whether or not you get, arrested, whether or not you get a ticket or a warning, whether or not you end up getting incarcerated or get probation or get, rehab or whatever. Is that kind of, you could say that at the end of the day, it actually comes down to economic differences. But because people of color experience economic deprivation at a racially disproportionate rate, basically economic inequality is the mechanism through which racialized inequality is able to play out in a situation like this.
It makes sense, because if you grow up in low-cost housing, they may have lead in the paint. You may drink water that has lead in it. The people in Flint, I think, are still dealing with their water problems then. There's no pulling yourself up by your bootstraps in that situation. And that's why we always talk about generational poverty. And that actually does have an impact on your brain, obviously, the environmental stressors. It goes back to the concept of ACE, adverse childhood experiences, that as you're growing, as from childhood, your brain is shaped by experience, and that includes both good experiences and bad experiences. So developmentally, when we're kids, we develop our visual system by looking at the world, and that creates the cortical columns, the columns in our brain that are dedicated to the visual system. So two Nobel Prize winners, Hubel and Wiesel, got the Nobel Prize for sewing a cat's eye closed during its youth, and then when it grew up, they had the visual experiences in one eye. Then they unsewed its eye. This was not the most ethical study at the time, but it showed that our visual cortex is shaped by experience. And then another place that our brain is shaped by experience is language. So the developmental your brain, you start processing language when you're born. Auditory input, producing language helps you learn a language, but you can learn specific languages after the age of about 13 or so. Sometime in your teenage years, that window closes. So that's why if you learn a language as an adult, you're more likely to like not be native level speakers. So, but the same can be said of bad experiences. So if you are there's a number of bad experiences. I won't like name them one by one on here. Whether you don't have access to enough food, you don't have access to clean water and air, you don't have somewhat social supports growing up, you have negative life experiences.
Experiencing racism.
Racism is actually
yeah.
becoming in the neuroscience world. Racism is actually starting to be formally known as racial trauma. So yeah, that actually does, although I hadn't thought about that because we never talked in the past when I it's been about 10 years since I've formally been in the ivory tower, and I've never heard of anyone talk about racial experience as a trauma. I mean, like informally, yes, we'd be like, that was a form of trauma, but like now after all of this stuff happening with George Floyd and everything, I think we're realizing that racial trauma is actually, racism is a form of racial trauma. And I think that makes so much more sense because now we can finally study something. Like my colleague, though not in science, I'm collaborating with this girl at the NIH. She's a scientist at the NIH. Her name is Lana Ruvolo, and she did a study that showed that racial trauma, racism actually impacts your brain. And when you have post-traumatic stress disorder, it actually has a neural basis. So there's a neural basis of racism in PTSD, which is really goes back to like, if you can find the neural basis of something, I would say that it's very real. But there's a lot of stuff that have a neural basis that we don't talk about. Like trauma has a very distinct neural basis. Chronic stress basically causes your adrenal, your HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, to create the stress hormone cortisol. And then that does a lot of things like mobilize your energy resources. But over time, if you're repeatedly exposed to chronic stress, the cortisol actually causes your brain cells to die. It's important to know about, because if you know that stress literally kills you, then you're more likely to not do stressful things, try to reduce stressors.
Definitely am a proponent, obviously, of like the neurobiological and cognitive and like hard science and sort of this kind of traditionally empirical, measurable evidence. And I think that is definitely like the basis of science. I just want to add that also the only kind of thing to remember is that just because we can't put it under a microscope or measure it yet doesn't mean it's not there. And I think this is part of the reason that maybe sociology and the social sciences have a bit more trouble being taken sort of seriously, is that a lot of things, like if you think about qualitative research in anthropology and sociology, a lot of what's being studied are really purely experiential things, like talking to people and interviewing with them and interviewing with groups and seeing sort of trends, but not things. So I think it's great to have that other aspect of it. But I just want to kind of add a note that it's also important, it's also important to take seriously experiences that people have, even if it's not something that can be like measured under a microscope.
Experiences are hard to measure quantitatively. There's no unit of trauma that you experience. Like we've all been in a huge trauma, which is the pandemic, for 3 years. And I'm sure that that's had an effect on all of us, because I'm not the same person I was in 2020. In some ways, I feel like I'm more resilient. And that's like another thing, is I wanted to definitely mention resilience as part of trauma, because if you're able to create a narrative for yourself in your, like for you, like I experienced such and such trauma, but I'm moving forward so that I can have I was in a pandemic, but luckily Fancy Comma helped everyone explain science better. And so now I have all these skills and I'm ready to apply them and learn from the lessons I learned in the pandemic. So that kind of thing can be really helpful in trauma. I'm currently reading The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And his whole thing is that when you experience trauma, the body keeps the score. So trauma takes a toll on you, in other words. And as I mentioned, it literally changes your brain, whether it's for better or for worse, who knows? Because, there's a lot of people that have like been in a war or something, and like now they're like a veteran or like a special forces soldier, may have like a lot of resilience. And people have done a lot of studies of special forces soldiers to see like what makes them resilient. But I don't think that as a society, we think about the role of trauma, because because it's just something we don't think about it. We don't think about like what does it mean to have a bad experience or like have a negative experience, or we don't reflect on our experiences that much, like in our everyday. We just like drive around in traffic, like someone almost drives into us, like that can be traumatic, but we just kind of, we're like, oh, whatever. And then we just keep driving. Then like the next time that happens, we kind of have this little panic attack response. So little things like that, to me, driving is actually like relatively safe and dangerous, because it's like just talking about driving makes me anxious. But the mental health community is making strides in understanding trauma and the role of trauma in our everyday experience. And because trauma makes us, it changes our brains, it makes us think differently, it makes us act differently. And so the idea of trauma-informed care in the mental health world helps understand how trauma leads to behavioral problems. And if we thought about trauma more, maybe we would try to end racism. We would try to be more diplomatic so there wouldn't be wars, because that creates trauma and refugees and everything. So, but like, how do we prioritize trauma in our everyday? I think that would start with like some degree of scientific literacy about trauma and what is trauma, and like, why do I feel so scared when I do something now if I've experienced something traumatic?
I think of sort of two things when you say, resilience, which I think is a really important thing to remember. So on the one hand, when thinking about like, decolonizing sciences and how we talk about Indigenous communities, how we talk about communities that are racialized as, communities of color that are marginalized in societies and have faced historical traumas, have faced, genocide, forced removal, slavery, Jim Crow, et cetera, and sort of carry through a sort of intergenerational collective memory of these things that creates an intergenerational trauma, but not so speaking about these experiences, specifically thinking about the idea of Indigenous communities or Native communities. There's, I've read sort of about a movement to talk about the idea of survivance. So rather than having sort of a victimization focus on things that on basically looking at Native people as just the sort of perpetually victimized community, also talking about, again, survivance, things like resilience, which I think is really important, but also I think we have to be careful not to get into this whole what doesn't kill you makes you stronger mentality, because then we can also start to glorify trauma, where it's like, oh, you've gone through so much trauma, then you must be a really strong person.
Yeah, because if you've gone through trauma, like, yeah, I survived trauma, but now I'm a little, trauma changes you. It makes you unable to, a lot of people that have gone through very serious traumas can't feel emotions normally. There was one story when I was a grad student at Georgetown. We had a medical neuroscience professor that was an anxiety researcher, and she gave a story. She told us a story about this guy who was a veteran. There was a helicopter passing over at a soccer game where she and this guy were there for like their kid's soccer game, and the guy, I guess he was like some kind of like a Vietnam veteran or something, because he dove into the bushes when he heard the helicopter. So that's kind of how I think about the intersection of trauma and criminality, is like, if you're faced with, like, you're talking to the law enforcement and you have trauma, there's a good chance that your trauma will be triggered in some way, because just because that you're a person that is dealing with traumas. So I wonder if we went through the jails and we asked everyone, like, did you like give them the ACEs questionnaire? Because you can do a questionnaire that tells you what level of adverse childhood experiences you've had. Like, have you ever, did your parents do drugs growing up, stuff like that. So,
but even beyond that, I would just add, like, I think that, this sort of group level, what we could call like collective trauma, take something like George Floyd and just the number of sort of police, I don't even know what is sort of the correct way to say it, but essentially, instances where individuals who were police were attempting to arrest them ended up dead through negligence or whatever of or overreaction of police officers. But
use of force is definitely a very big
over excessive
problem.
use of force that led to mortality. But thinking about the reactions, and thinking about things like reacting so-called uncooperatively, like maybe you just feel frozen when a cop pulls you over because you're so scared that it's going to end up this way, or resisting arrest or fleeing. which may, I mean, I don't know the science on this, but I would be curious to see if there's a connection between the likelihood of reacting in a sort of survival mode way and seeing these sorts of, thinking of that as a possible outcome.
That's why a lot of people with mental health problems are often have really bad interactions with law enforcement, and I think it's because because like you get pulled over, you're already scared. Like if I had
Yes.
like I don't want to get a ticket. Like I don't want to
Yeah.
get called out for like whatever I just did on the road. Like I don't know. Like maybe it's because I'm an MIT graduate, like overachiever. Like one of my least favorite things is listening to the police officer tell me what I did that was like wrong. But it's like if you have a mental health problem or you're traumatized, you have a trauma. Maybe your trauma has to do with the way that you have been treated by law enforcement. That would make it terrible. So like a lot of and that's why I think there really is a need for actionable reforms like tracking use of force. Fancy Comma has worked on some law enforcement reform work with that argument that if we increase transparency and accountability in policing, we can help make police be the protectors of the people. So like restoring public trust in that. But it's really interesting. Like I wonder to what extent, I doubt that anyone has thought about like the role of trauma in interactions with law enforcement, but I feel like there's definitely something there. But that's the thing with trauma, because you can't measure it, you can't put a label on it. You can put a label on it, but then you're always like, oh, well, that wasn't that bad. Like I'm still alive.
And because no two people necessarily see the color green the same way, no two people necessarily experience one type of trauma the exact same way or have the same type of reaction. And this is part of the issue of sort of like high crime rates in certain communities, and also especially in Native communities in the U.S., among various other things that sort of feed into that. But that distrust of law enforcement also compels people not to report things when they happen. So essentially, it basically people would rather just sort of deal with a threat of violence than get the police involved because they view the police as a larger threat.
And I think that that's a huge problem. And I think that the police themselves are dealing with some trauma also. So that's why when you think about like what the real problems are, it's like people don't trust the people that are meant to keep them safe. Like that's a huge problem for society. And it's like, is there really a solution there? Like I feel like there is one. It is a hard one. It forces everyone to talk to each other. And that's a difficult conversation. And sometimes it's like, does that even really work? Because Fancy Comma was involved in doing this kind of work. And I followed the news really closely. And at the end, senators from Senator Scott created a police reform bill, and then in the House, and then the Democrats did one as well, and they ultimately did not agree on ending qualified immunity, because that's what Senator Booker really wanted, was to end qualified immunity for police officers. So that's kind of like protecting them, like as malpractice is for doctors, that's kind of what qualified immunity is for law enforcement. And so nothing really got done there. And so I was like, well, I just spent all my blood, sweat, and tears like working on this. Like nothing came of this, and I really want this problem to get better. But sometimes change takes a lot of time, and it's not always what you expect it will be. It requires everyone to be on board, especially for these like federal reforms. Like I think the president did just do some update so like for the federal government to provide money to local police departments, they require some data reporting on like use of force and stuff. I think so. And I think the states, I don't know about like local police departments, but this kind of stuff is really important. And even though it's a difficult topic to talk about, I think it's something that we will definitely be talking about forever. And
I mean, it's not an issue that started years ago. I mean, it's not an issue that started with Rodney King. It's an issue that's been ongoing since, the civil rights era, where police dogs were used to hold back.
And even before then, back when we were in the Crusades, like I don't think that people, I don't know, maybe this is very fatalistic. I don't think people are capable of regulating each other because
or at least not perfectly, not ideally, that they're
And I think that if we can understand human behavior better, that's the neuroscientist in me. Like if we can understand human behavior better, be like then we can all get along better, and there like won't be any war, and there will never be any conflict. But
or maybe just accept imperfection, like accept the fact that we're going to have to try something and then figure out what's not working and then perfect it, and that's just, it's that we're going to have to be in a constant state of reevaluation. And sort of reorganization.
I think it's really important for people that are involved in this kind of work, to have multiple areas of expertise, like journalism. I'm a scientist. I'm also a science communicator. I'm also a journalist. I'm also a policy wonk. I wear all of these different hats. I interned on Capitol Hill in early 2017, and that helped me understand the policy aspects of everything. It was always my dream to work on Capitol Hill. And I actually did attend a briefing on law enforcement issues, and it was really chill. The officer was really nice. He actually gave out his phone number to like everyone. I don't have any more, but I don't have any of my notes from when I worked in Congress, which is really bizarre. But actually, there's a huge need for people that think about things critically, like research-minded people like us, like other scientists and sociologists, to contribute their input. And it was actually my Capitol Hill experience that got me into journalism, because there was a briefing in the pandemic that was about long COVID survivors being able to get diagnoses. And there was a woman, an African-American middle school teacher named Shamir Smith, and she was testifying about her inability to get a long COVID diagnosis because she just couldn't get a diagnosis. And so I decided to interview her, and then I ended up doing an article with NPR SciCommers, which is now called BU SciCommers, and it got accepted to the NPR Shots blog, which was really cool. But then all of this stuff happened in August 2021. Like, there was the pandemic, there was like the pullout from the Middle East, and there was like a lot of other stuff. So my editor was super burned out and was working 12-hour days back then at NPR. So I actually think that like a lot of people quit NPR after that, because I heard they had a shakeup a while back. And all of that to say, now I have these many different perspectives from which to look at something. Like I write with a journalistic mindset. I analyze data with a scientific mindset, because scientists, and I don't know if sociologists do this, but scientists always want to spout facts like 24/7. Like, I have to stop myself sometimes from just like straight up delivering facts. Like,
that's social scientists as well. Definitely
it must
social
be like
scientists too.
the researcher urge to constantly provide facts 24/7, because I appreciate that when people, because the world is so full of misinformation. Sometimes you just want people to tell you the actual truth.
Yes. Or at least be like, I've got an article you need to read. I've got a book you need to read, this author, this study.
So that's part of why I founded Fancy Comma, to show scientists, and I guess sociologists also, that their skills are needed outside of the ivory tower if we're to solve 21st century problems, of which there are many. So I guess we've already talked about this.
I think we kind of touched on most all of the questions that we had, I think. I'm trying to think if there was anything. Yeah, because we already touched on sort of, the value of SciComm and things like policy. I mean, things like being aware of the connection between trauma and incarceration, not just that having had trauma makes you more likely to be incarcerated in the sense of making you more likely to conduct behavior that is more likely to get arrested or end up in incarceration, but also that incarceration itself is traumatic or re-traumatizing. It's not only traumatic to the person who's incarcerated, it's traumatic to their family, to their children, to their spouses or partners, et cetera, to their friends. And then even, once you get out of incarceration, reintegration is a serious issue. A lot of people find it very challenging to sort of survive, really, to find jobs, to find housing, to reform relationships back in communities. So it's just the entire thing. And I think, creating SciComm, social SciComm, can play a very important role, at least specifically with this topic, in increasing sort of public awareness of, public awareness that just thinking about public policy, for example, that could potentially make people more likely to support funding for things like mental health and substance abuse counseling while incarcerated, or following up afterwards, or, housing and employment programs for people after they get released from incarceration, or, hopefully more counseling and more services provided to people before they get incarcerated to help them,
I think that a lot of these problems start at childhood. So like if you're a kid and you experience adverse life events, maybe you'll, because, that's when your brain's developing when you're a kid. And that's when, if you have these adverse life events, so if we had more laws that were focused on helping kids live more trauma-free lives, like everyone always talks about universal pre-K, because actually universal pre-K boosts your like IQ and stuff. So, I went to preschool and I went to MIT. So there's one but there's many studies. They talk about we have to invest our children by making it easier for them to get access to education early on, to help them have better early life outcomes. And I wonder to what extent our laws can actually like improve that so that we can, because you really, as a kid, I guess growing up, you don't realize this, but what the things you do, the experiences you have as a kid are really important for, because apparently, according to Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote that book, The Body Keeps the Score, childhood experiences and childhood trauma can be much more traumatic and bad than even like trauma that you experience later on in life. So I wonder if Bessel van der Kolk would agree with me that like if we went through the prison and asked people about their traumas, where they would probably find like a lot of them. And so I wonder if we're really incarcerating and stigmatizing people that have already been traumatized in many respects. And I find that really fascinating.
Well, addressing economic inequality also, because as I mentioned, that is really kind of the key mechanism driving inequality. I mean, women tend to be poorer than men in general. It varies by race, but I don't know why I went down that road. That's a little bit that adds to like the trauma, but
like
they're
mothers a lot and stuff.
Exactly.
And they don't really like.
But they tend to aren't as represented in
the gender pay gap also
incarceration. But definitely there's racialized differences in economic inequality, like racialized group level inequality. But I think addressing the economic gap, if not addressing it as creating equality of wages, at least create equality of access to services, things like access to food stamps or childhood education and things like that. So I think hopefully recognizing all of the factors that sort of play into this outcome of incarceration or disproportionate incarceration could be addressed.
Yeah, and I think both social science communication or #SocialSciComm and also science communication can play a role here, because the social aspect is obviously the way that we like looking at society, looking at different groups, like why are different groups marginalized in the prison, jails, etc. The scientific aspect, like understanding the neuroscience of trauma, understanding maybe even the neuroscience of recidivism, because apparently it's linked, I just learned this today, it's linked to substance abuse disorder in a lot of cases, because I Googled, is trauma related to going to jail? And then I learned that people with PTSD are much more likely to have recidivism. The source I found was from the University of Illinois, and I think it was talking specifically about drug convictions, but I wonder to what extent like other crimes, like there's a ton of different crimes out
certainly
there.
Like violence, things like domestic violence and such are definitely linked. I mean, I know there is a lot of criminological research that talks about the connection between, specifically things like between ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and incarceration and substance abuse, and whether you are the perpetrator or the victim of something like domestic violence, etc. So yeah, at least in my neck of the woods, in my academic neck of the woods, that's definitely something that is talked about a lot.
Interesting. This gives me a lot of food for thought, like especially the combination of science and sociology. I feel like is very powerful to truly solve problems for like in the world. And I wonder, and I think it has to do with the fact that scientists are kind of siloed from society. We like to think that we're just doing science every day, but truly you can't do science in a vacuum. Science happens in the context of society, performed by society. Scientists are members of society. And I think that's something, sometimes scientists don't grasp that enough. Like they kind of feel like they're outside of society, but then like something happens and they're like, oh, well, like remember the March on Science. Like I was really proud of scientists for being political, like marching for science, because I feel like they finally started to collectively organize and make their issues more known. So I don't know if sociology has like a march for sociology, but they should do one as
that
well.
I'm aware of. Yeah, I mean, I know science, the hard side. always a little bit, I'm like, sociology is a science as well, but it's a social science. So it's when we talk about sciences, like most people I think are referring to like the natural sciences. But, you know, I think that among like natural scientists or among the non-social scientists, there tends to be this sort of way of approaching, and this is, you know, some sociologists look at it this way too, but there tends to be a way of approaching data and research and findings as that you're looking for this pure, unadulterated truth, right? So you're trying to find this like perfect in a vacuum truth. And I think that kind of speaks to sort of that approach where it's like, oh, you know, scientists are supposed to be unbiased. Like you should always be unbiased in your research, which it's like, yes, you should always try to be unbiased, but we're humans. So it's kind of impossible to not have some sort of perceptual bias.
Yeah. And it's important to know those biases, and they're not even, sometimes there's systematic methodological biases, like the fact that clinical trials are heavily white and male is something that wasn't even really like a huge deal until the pandemic. And now seems like the NIH just like I saw these people on Twitter that got grants. They're studying like racial stress and all this other stuff that 10 years ago, I don't think we were really studying that. I think that scientists have really finally kind of been able to understand the role that they have in solving problems in society and understanding the things that we don't really talk about, that we kind of have an understanding of like informally to ourselves, but like rigorously studying them using science. I think that's very powerful. And I think that's somewhere that science and sociology can both be helpful and play a role. Hello, editing Shiva here. As you can see, I've just drank caffeine for several hours and not looking my greatest, but I just wanted to say thank you for watching our first YouTube video that I was able to edit. Follow us on social media at Fancy Comma on Twitter and Instagram. Visit our website, www.fancycomma.com, and scroll to the bottom for a list of our full social media presence. Thanks again.